Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning back into Fantasy Sports Review. I'm Phil Hargis. It's good to see you again. Sorry we haven't been with you the last couple weeks. We've had a couple bye weeks of our own, but we're back with you now. We're into the first week of the fantasy playoffs. It's the most exciting time of the year, and hopefully if you're watching, your team's in the playoffs, and that's why you're here. So we had just really one of the best weekends of all time last week, and it was like blizzard weekend all along the East Coast last weekend. Almost every single game had snow in it. The Redskins game, the Baltimore game. All those games up there, heaven forbid, the Philly game was just awesome against the Lions in the blizzard. Megatron with a face full of snow. That's what football season to me is all about. The reindeers out there in the snow making fantasy football stuff. And you know what? We're going to dispel one of the great myths of fantasy football history that we've ever had is that bad weather games do not have almost no effect on fantasy performance at all, and that was evidenced by one of the most highest scoring weekends, if not the highest scoring weekend in NFL history last weekend, and then again in the freezing cold Monday Night Football Chicago, high scoring affair. No matter what the weather is, start your fantasy studs. It does not matter. Now let's get on to the games. We have a special guest in studio tonight. We have an old face. Doug Cook is back in studio after a long bye season of his own. Doug, it's good to see you again, man. How you doing?
How you doing, man? Good to see you. I don't know where you've been this whole time. I've been doing this fantasy sports show for a long time, and you just disappeared for like 2 years. So I don't know what you did, what to make of it.
If you guys don't recognize, if you're new to the show and you haven't seen it the last couple of years, we've seen Robbie in this state. Doug is one of the founding fathers of Fantasy Sports Review back in 2001. So he did it for a lot of years. He tried his hand at other markets, and now he's back in D.C., and it's great to have him back on the air, Doug. Does that mean that we're never going to see Robbie again?
Yeah, I would hope we see Robbie again, too, because, we'll see if you guys fire me after this show, but I plan on sticking around.
All right, did you bring any weather bunnies with you? Because we haven't had the weather bunnies in a while either.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with those either. They must have followed me somewhere else.
All the bunnies are always following Doug. Hopefully he will bring the bunnies back into the studio here so we can have bunnies once again. And who also has been with us since the very beginning is Steve Mullen, our faithful director. He's been there since episode number 1. Actually, he joined around episode number 5, I think it was, of Fantasy Sports Review. But Steve Mullen is also the co-host of Sports Scope, which can be seen here on Channel 10. He's always been here with us, and he's, without Steve Mullen, this show would never happen. So, Doug, you remember Steve, and I'm sure you had a nice reunion with him before the show. But let's get on to things, man. You been watching some football this season?
I've been watching as many games as I can. I think I missed a couple, but I sit back on Sunday and, I just watch all the games as much as possible. And believe it or not, I hate to admit this, but I decided to take actually the year off playing fantasy football this year, which is interesting for me. Take a new perspective. I just, want to just take a year off and see what happens. And it's still as much fun for me watching the games. It's just a lot less stressful.
No, it's not as much fun to watch without a team. So what are the differences? You're not playing fantasy football, so you're watching the games. How does that affect your Sunday rituals, basically, of watching football without any fantasy implications whatsoever?
Yeah, well, I just sit back and watch as many games as possible, and I like to cheer for my Dolphins, so I get to cheer for all my Dolphins without worrying about any fantasy football implications, and I get to cheer against the teams that I hate, like Baltimore and, Pittsburgh, except I've had to cheer for them on occasion because of the playoff race, and now I'm, of course, cheering against Baltimore, who had that barn-burning fourth quarter with Minnesota, and ended up pulling out the game in the last few seconds, which was awful because they're in a virtual tie with Miami for the last playoff spot.
So what's more stressful, when Miami gets a touchdown run back on them to lose the game, or when your fantasy team is down by 5 going into Monday Night Football?
I think the Monday Night Football fantasy football is a lot more stressful than anything else. So I've been lowering my stress levels by not playing this year, and I'll probably play again, for the playoffs. After the playoffs roll around, do some playoff fantasy football. Do
you think you watch the games any differently without doing fantasy? Do you just focus really more on the Dolphins, or do you still get around to see all the games?
I focus on mostly just the action and, turn on that red zone channel on at least one screen, turn my Dolphins on the other screen, and I just, try to watch as much action as possible without specifically, just paying attention to the players I have. I get more of a picture, more of a complete picture of the action by watching it that way.
It's definitely something I can't relate to at all. I mean, I really have no comment, but I think that I'm actually going to adopt the exact opposite approach. I'm going to renounce my loyalties at all to the Washington Redskins, right here on the air for the first time. I'm done with the Redskins. 20 years of losing, same stuff, drama in the air, arguments over the team name, going to games and losing every time on a weekly basis. I think it's over. I'm just going to go off into football outer space and play fantasy football. And the Redskins, if they win or lose, it's not my concern anymore. It's the end of the Redskins. I renounce my loyalties. A lifetime of loyalty, Doug, is gone out the window right now here on Fantasy Sports Review.
Yeah, and as we got to see the sneak preview of the new episode of Sports Scope, Steve and Robbie had a nice discussion about 10 minutes long about the ineptitude of the coaching staff of the Washington Redskins and the complete discombobulation that they're in right now.
The entire franchise, from the coaching, the ownership, the players, it's in a complete state of discombobulation. It has been for the last 20 years. They can't do anything right. The fans continue to pay higher prices for the tickets.
Why?
And they get no experience. They stay loyal to the team. They don't even like the owner. They don't like the team name. Why are the fans still fans of this team? It's mind-boggling. It's like mental illness. I mean, I was there too. I just can't do it anymore, Doug. I just can't do it. I'm a Bengals fan sort of by assimilation here with my friend and her cousin playing for the Bengals there. It's fun to go root on a team that especially now is in playoff contention. It's exciting to see them. And, I'll ride the Bengals bandwagon for a while and then, it's not worried about worrying about the home team. It'll just be all about, fun and fantasy and just what football is really supposed to be all about, having a good time and enjoying your Sunday by yourself. But let's go ahead and we've gotten to the fantasy playoffs here. You guys are probably in the playoffs. Hopefully you won your games last weekend. There was some weird stuff that happened in those games because there was the weather. You made some controversial lineup decisions because of the bad weather and all the snow. I know I tried to avoid players in those games and made some stupid decisions because of them. But there's not really much more to talk about matchup-wise. Who your guys are going to be here going forward into the next semifinals and the finals of the playoffs. But let's do a little year in review thing here on the quarterbacks and see what the surprises are and the not-so-surprises here. Doug, we always like to say this part has never changed. We're starting off the quarterbacks here, man, and Peyton Manning is the top of the list. Is that a surprise for you? He wasn't really the top quarterback drafted. Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees were the top two, and then it was sort of Peyton Manning.
Yeah, there was a lot of uncertainty about Peyton coming in because of the injury and so forth. But he's done a spectacular job, and he's on pace to possibly set a new touchdown record for the season by topping the record that Brady currently has that Peyton had for about 1 year, I think, before Brady broke it, or 1 or 2 years before Brady broke it, which is, that'll be interesting to see. Drew Brees, of course, always does well. And Matthew Stafford has really turned it up a notch this year with Megatron. And Cam Newton back where he's supposed to be after an off year. Now he's back, in which we predicted he would bounce back from a subpar year.
Yeah, if you look at that list, the top 12, not a real lot of variation there as far as how the top 12 go. You just had to kind of rank them yourself and take them in the order that you wanted them. Rivers maybe a little bit higher than most people drafted. He was probably drafted towards the bottom half of that top 12 list. And obviously, that's due to the fact that he's had an awesome year. They had the good matchups against the NFC East teams who are obviously very, very weak against the pass this year. So Rivers is definitely having an outstanding season because of that matchup favoritism there. And of course, Aaron Rodgers, the guy that was drafted number 1, number 2 overall in a lot of quarterbacks in a lot of these drafts. He's now had the injury. He may be coming back. I don't know if that's I don't really expect him to come back, but they may throw him in there because they're still not technically alive, but they're basically dead. It's going to be Carolina and San Fran getting the wild cards.
Yeah, I don't think they have much of a playoff shot at this point, especially with Rodgers not playing. They're just a different team without him, just like the Colts are a different team without. You can see Andrew Luck up there. He was up there higher earlier this season before Reggie Wayne got hurt. Now they can't do much. They can't do diddly-poo offensively, really. Yeah,
Doug, yes, exactly. And, that's really surprising to me. I thought that Luck would be able to sort of take over the commander role of that team. And obviously they fell to pieces as soon as Andrew Luck. They'll be the first team eliminated from the playoffs in a couple of weeks here in January when the NFL playoffs start. And there's really no other real big surprises. Griffin, maybe people would have thought would have been higher, and Brady a little bit higher. I thought Romo would definitely be top 5, top 6, and maybe he's a little bit lower. But he's been fine, basically, if you have any of these top 12 guys. But again, it goes to show you that, you can take Manning in the first round, and maybe it would have been worth it this year. But outside of that, 338 down to 261 quarterbacks, you're talking about a matter of 4 or 5 points on any given week. wait until the 7th, 8th, 9th round and get the best of the 11th, 12th, 13th quarterbacks are left on the board and get a couple of them at that time. That's the way to draft the quarterbacks in fantasy football, Doug.
Sure.
Okay,
Yep.
moving on to running backs, Doug. Again, this is kind of a weird thing that happened in fantasy this year. Yeah, you see a lot of the top guys there in the top spots, but there's not a lot of huge variation in the fantasy production from these guys. If you would have taken a guy in the 5th, 6th, 7th round for running back, you're going to be doing great. You'll be right up there. If you could have got a Woodhead, Chris Johnson had fallen far in drafts this year, Giovanni Bernard, Fred Jackson, who was a super value. You can get these guys. Noshawn Moreno, mid-round, 10th round pick this year.
Yeah, and he's really stepped it up and taken advantage of the fact that Peyton Manning is his quarterback. You know, he's gotten a lot of receiving yards. He's already double-digit, the only person in double-digit touchdowns that, doesn't have over 1,000 yards rushing so far. And people nowadays, running backs are not going to run, in general, much more than, 1,000, 1,200 yards. Maybe 1,500 yards per season because of all the committees and so forth.
Doug, I know you've done a lot of statistical analysis on running backs and following up career years in the past. I mean, Adrian Peterson coming off that epic year last year. Were you surprised to see him unable to repeat that type of performance this year?
No, not at all. But he's definitely having a solid year. He's not going to. They never do reproduce the epic year 2 years in a row unless their name is Eric Dickerson. And really, there's no running backs named that in the league. So.
Right, and he's not even number one. He fell down to 5. I mean, sometimes they can repeat as number 1, but like Peterson last year doubled the guy that was in second place with his production in that outstanding season that he had last year. But yeah, I mean, I think the running backs, you're sort of seeing a changing of the guard here as far as fantasy football philosophy is in drafting these players. I think we can talk about that as soon as we get through the receivers and the tight ends. And I'll definitely share with you my thoughts on how draft strategy for FY 2014 should be. It's going to, as far as I'm concerned, my strategy is going to be way different than it's ever been in your past years.
Yep, I can understand that.
Calvin Johnson, Megatron, was definitely the consensus number one receiver, and he's not disappointing this year at all. He's number 1. He's a dominant force, and if you have him on your team, chances are you're going to be in the playoffs. And a lot of these guys are the top guys that you would have expected to be drafted in the top 4 or 5 guys. I mean, Brandon Marshall, not Andre Johnson, but Demaryius Thomas, Antonio Brown, now that he's the guy with Mike Wallace there, and AJ Green. Those are your top 5 guys going into the preseason, and almost held the form right there.
Yeah, that's that was pretty much formful. And one thing about this particular set of receivers I like to look at is you got 3 of them in this top 15 list that are that are from the Denver Broncos. They're receivers for Peyton Manning. 2 of them have double-digit touchdowns already. The third one, Eric Decker, he's probably going to join them in double-digit touchdowns by the end of the season. All he needs is 2 more. And certainly Welker, is eligible to break 1,000 yards as well.
Yeah, I mean, anybody on Denver's fantasy gold, you got to draft him accordingly. And Decker was certainly the value play out of that bunch. And no doubt about it. And of course, Noshawn Moreno, who was on the previous page. Our Washington Redskin boy here, not ours, but your Washington Redskin boy here, Pierre Garçon. He's had a decent season in PPR leagues, but has been completely useless in touchdown leagues. He's only got 3, which is by far the lowest on that list. Just no good right there at all. And
Andre Johnson's touchdowns are abnormally low too because of the the suckage of the Houston Texans this year.
Yep, Foster got hurt. The quarterbacks suck.
Yeah, they're kind of completely inept as well. Josh Gordon to me is probably the biggest surprise on this list.
Do you expect to see him in the top 3 next year, Doug? Mm-hmm. You do. He'll follow up a 1-year explosion and be in the top 3 again. See, I disagree. I thought that the guys that were overdrafted this year were Julio Jones, Des Bryant. Julio got hurt, so he's on this list. Des Bryant, he is not the top 2 or 3 receiver that he was drafted this year. He was overdrafted because of all the hype surrounding him after last year. Yeah,
that's what happens. I'd be kind of surprised again to see Gordon follow up that year as well.
I don't think I could draft him in the 2nd round next year based on 1 season of experience like that. I won't be able to do it.
No,
I'll pass.
I can't do it that way as well.
Antonio Brown, I would. I mean, this is his sort of his emergent year, but he's now the go-to guy, and he's proven it. I think that he'll be able to repeat that kind of performance next year. It'll be fun to talk about the 14 season. We'll have to do a sort of mock draft here in the next couple of weeks and see how that turns out. Anything else on the receivers there, man? Jordy Nelson has been able to sort of hold on to some of his top 12 status there, despite the fact they've had this quarterback problems in Green Bay. Deshaun Jackson, a little bit of an upside season this year. He was definitely drafted later than the number 11 wide receiver. I thought that was a pretty good pick because Macklin got hurt in the preseason. It looked like he was going to get a lot more of attention, and nobody was really sure how good Riley Cooper would be. In fact, it's kind of surprising not to see Riley Cooper on that list. He's probably just like 4 or 5 slots down after that because he's had a phenomenal season. He's definitely a guy that I'll avoid next year. I can promise you that. Okay, tight ends. Jimmy Graham, Doug, 262 fantasy points. Pretty damn good for the number 1 tight end drafted overall.
Yeah, he's towering over the rest of those tight ends pretty clearly.
Yeah, and then the rest of the guys, I mean, Gronkowski's obviously didn't make this list. He didn't play the first 6 or 7 games of the season. And, he hasn't been able to crack that list, and now he's gone for the season, so he'll definitely not be on that list. The guy from Owen Daniels, he got hurt. He's not on the list. And, sort of a changing of the guard. We got these younger guys like this Julius Thomas, the Charles Clays. Coming up higher, Kobe Fleener's kind of emerged this year, especially with Reggie Wayne leaving due to injury. And, some of these other guys, you drafted them as the 3rd or 4th, 5th tight ends on your roster. Guys like Gonzo, Gates, the aging Jason Witten. Vernon Davis is still pretty solid. But, again, you're not going to use an early pick on those when you can get guys later on in the draft like Martellus Bennett or Kobe Fleener, or heaven forbid, nobody drafted Garrett Graham. You get those guys later on in the draft. Just get them.
Right, and Jordan Cameron, another.
Get a couple of them, though. Don't just draft one.
Right. I mean, they're in some ways they're a lot more reliable than running backs, and you can get a good VBD if you get somebody like that. Jordan Cameron, kind of a surprise being up that high as well, and Julius Thomas, another Denver wide receiver with double-digit touchdowns. I don't think he's going to make 1,000 yards. It's somewhat possible, but that'll be 4 Denver guys in double-digit touchdowns as receivers. And
he missed a couple games too. Otherwise, he'd probably be right up there in the thick of things, and he probably wouldn't get there anyway. I mean, he still would need 350 yards plus to get to that point. But solid.
And Charles Clay is another good surprise, pleasant surprise for the Dolphins. And I've tried to watch, of course, as many Dolphins games as possible. And if you watched him even last week, just shrugging off Paul Mullet. Like he was some 2-bit defensive back, and he does that game in and game out. There will be one play where he just starts bowling over defenders. He's pretty impressive.
He's a bully?
He bullies them, yeah.
Okay, so this is what I want to say. So fantasy for 2014 fantasy football strategy going into the draft. I'm still going to wait and get my quarterbacks later on in the draft. I'm not going to go after the Manning. I'm not going to go after the Breeze. I'm not going to go after the Rodgers. I'm definitely not going to go after Rodgers. I definitely believe that I can get a guy like Rivers, Newton, Russell Wilson, any of those guys in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th round. I'm going to get those guys, Doug. But I'm not going. I'm going to completely ignore the running back position next year. All I'm going to do in the first 4 or 5 rounds is get running receivers and tight ends. If I can get him in every league, I want Jimmy Graham as my number 1 player. I think that he's such a dominant force at his position that he should be the number 1 or number 2 guy taken. I want him or Calvin Johnson on every single one of my teams next year.
That's an interesting take. I think I would disagree on Rodgers. I think when he comes back next year, he's going to be as good as usual. I don't think his injury isn't really that serious, and they're holding him out as more of a precautionary means and just kind of saving him for next year. I don't know why they didn't put him in, earlier. They could have still been in the playoff race, but consequently, they're not in the playoff race anymore at all because of this injury. But I think he'll come back and be fine.
Are you going to draft him in the 2nd or 3rd round?
I don't know. I mean, I think he deserves to be drafted where those other, top 5 quarterbacks like Manning and Breeze and so forth go. But, that's just me. And going back to what you said about at the beginning of the show about the Blizzard games and all these reindeer we had emerging. You can't even rely on what the commentators say or the past experience of the players in the snow or out the snow. For example, they said Ryan Tannehill had never played a game in the snow in his career in high school, college, or the NFL. Of course, it's only his 2nd NFL year, but and he came out and had an excellent game and then won the game. They beat the Steelers barely, avoiding a last-second almost Auburn debacle. And his running backs that hadn't run in the snow before, like Lamar Miller, they did well, and as well as running backs for other teams. In fact, there was, like you said, it was a high-scoring weekend. There was 85 touchdowns during the daytime games, according to the host of the NFL Red Zone Network, which was a record for that Red Zone show.
And they end up with over 100 touchdowns for the entire weekend, which was an NFL record also.
Yeah.
And a blizzard. In a blizzard weekend and just really cold weather all across the country. I mean, I thought a perfect example was that game on Monday Night Football where the temperatures were in the teens, low 10s, and wind chills with those winds down near zero, and they had no problems putting up 70 points between them.
Yeah, and the Minnesota-Baltimore game looked like a pillow fight the entire game. I mean, I think there was 15 points scored in the first 3 quarters, and then all of a sudden, when the blizzard stopped at the end, there's still snow on the field, but they started exploding in the fourth quarter, and it turned into a barn burner.
Yeah, 6 touchdowns in the fourth quarter, I think.
That is crazy.
Yeah, shaking my head at that one still.
SMH.
Yeah, seriously, Doug. Let's go on and take a quick look at the matchups now. So again, next year, my top 2 picks, Jimmy Graham and Calvin Johnson. I'll take them number 1 and number 2 overall. As crazy as that sounds,
picks.
I'm going to do it. Malik, I hope you're not watching right now, but that's what my plan is for next year. You can take Manning. I'm going to get Jimmy Graham, all right? Okay, moving on to the Week 15 schedule, Doug. These are the matchups. We probably don't need to talk about the Thursday night game. It's a big one. It's San Diego and Denver, but it'll be past us by the time we get there. And obviously, at this point, you're going to play all your Denver players. This is a pretty good matchup for Rivers against Denver's suspect defense. And
San Diego has been a really suspect defense as well. They've been shaky and allow a lot of points. So yeah, obviously you have to play Denver. It'll end up being a kind of a barn burner probably, but Denver will handle them, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It's a bit, this is a bigger game for San Diego. I mean, they really need this game. Denver's kind of set. I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see San Diego pull this one out.
It's possible. Denver is set, but they don't have home field advantage locked up yet. So.
And a game that I no longer care about, the Washington Atlanta. This is really a battle of the 2 of the worst teams in the entire NFL.
They're not any good.
2 playoff teams last year, 2 of the worst teams in the NFL this year.
Yeah, and neither of them have very good playoff aspirations.
Kirk Cousins, will he be a good fantasy start this year? We can get him off of waiver wires. You're going to start him in your fantasy playoffs because of this somewhat good matchup, and he needs to he has 3 games to showcase himself and make a name for himself if he wants to replace RG3 or get a good trade in the offseason.
Yeah, that's true. I mean,
roll the dice. Don't think twice. He'd be a great FanDuel play. I mean, obviously he's a great FanDuel play. FanDuel, I think everybody will have him.
Yeah, that's possible. And then San Fran versus the upstart Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That actually, earlier in the season, you'd say that's not a game. San Fran was, it's a defending Super Bowl contender, finalist, and Tampa was awful to start the season, but they're coming around and they're winning a lot of games now. So it could be a serious matchup. Yeah,
Glennon, I think that here's an interesting thing about it. I was thinking about Tampa Bay earlier today. I was talking about with some of my other fantasy football experts that I talked to. Their running back, they seem to have almost a Denver system where they just plug and play whatever running back they have in there. Like Doug Martin, everybody came out and thought he was great this year. And they drafted him in the first round. And look, he gets injured, and everybody that's filled in for him ever since, most recently Bobby Rainey, have been very good, successful fantasy players in that system.
And I wouldn't hesitate. San Fran has one of the better defenses, but I wouldn't hesitate to play some of those guys for Tampa Bay at home if I had them.
Okay, Doug, this is a funny game here with the Seahawks and the Giants. We definitely want the Giants to lose. I mean, I still hate the Giants. I still hate the teams in the NFC East. I just won't like the Redskins anymore.
Right. Giants, another big disappointment this year in Seattle. You can't put it past them to win any game, especially on the road against a losing team.
Coming across country, though, it could be a challenge, but you're not going to bench any of those guys.
Yeah, it'll be a challenge. Russell Wilson's been excellent. The road game and going across, so it's going to be 10 o'clock a.m. but for Seattle, basically playing on that game. So that's the only thing to really worry about, I think, as far as that's concerned.
There's not supposed to be any crazy snow this weekend either.
Right, and the Giants can be feisty at home as well. Philadelphia, Minnesota. Well, all of a sudden, Minnesota thought they were a contender last week until they lost to the last second in Baltimore, which I wish they hadn't have done, because then the Dolphins, who are playing, and the Philadelphia is a good team as well, and what remains to be seen is who's going to be their quarterback next year.
Yeah, it's going to be Foles for sure, and Philadelphia needs this game because they still have Dallas right on their heels, and they pulled that one out last weekend in the blizzard against Detroit. I mean, if that blizzard didn't stop, I think the Eagles would have gone on and lost that game, but but they did, and the snow stopped, and they were able to. Shady McCoy just started running like the reindeer that he is, and pulling that one out for him. But Philadelphia, Minnesota has played the NFC East tough, so I wouldn't be surprised them to really fight down to the end there with Philadelphia, and maybe even pull the upset there, because that's how bad the NFC East is. Chip Kelly, I'm still not sold on him being the great coach that everybody says he is.
He might not be.
That could be an upset. That could be the upset of the day right there.
Now, the big game of the day is, of course, New England at Miami.
Tell us, Doug. Tell us.
So Miami is as you know, they've been going back and forth. They've been going back and forth all year. They've been winning games they should lose, and they've been losing games they should win. And now, of course, Tom Brady is down to one of his receivers from last year?
Yes. Edelman and Amendola.
Yeah, so I mean they're seriously handicapped without their two tight ends, which were the big ones last year.
Shane Vereen's basically a receiver, though.
And New England typically will lose a game at Miami every other year. So Miami's, I'm not going to say they're definitely going to win, but they got a good chance at that game.
And they need it, and they need it badly. We have a couple minutes left here. Let's just go ahead and scoot ahead to some of the more important games on the day. And, Kansas City, Oakland. That's not really that big of a game anymore. Oakland's kind of out of it. Kansas City's kind of got locked up. Chicago definitely needs to win their game to kind of stay in pace there in the NFC, in their division, the North. And let's see what else here. Green Bay and Dallas. That could be the return of Aaron Rodgers. That'd be an interesting one to see there if they do, in fact, bring him back. If they do, they need to win the game, and so does Dallas. That would be a huge game.
Yeah, and the Jets are in discombobulation this season, at this point in the season, and can't seem to do anything right. So, and Carolina's starting to do everything right with, Cam Newton back on target. So they'll probably, I would definitely start a lot of Carolina players if I had them.
Cincinnati can basically end the playoff lives for Pittsburgh there if they want to.
They can do it. They have to do it on the road at Pittsburgh. That's going to be tough. That's tough for any team. So that's going to be an interesting matchup. New Orleans, St. Louis could be interesting.
And Baltimore, Detroit, you got to start your guys there on Monday Night Football. They have to. Both those teams have to win those games to keep their playoff hopes alive as well. That should be a pretty entertaining Monday Night Football game.
Yeah, it will be. The Sunday night game and the Monday night game are pretty good for once.
All right, dude. Well, listen, man, it's great to have you back on the show and talking some football, getting ready for the end of the season. We'll have our playoff shows here. Maybe we'll do some playoff predictions next week.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it sounds like a good idea.
All right, and Mr. Steve Mullen, thank you for directing the show. Steve, obviously, you can see his show here, Sports Scope, on FPA Channel 10. You can see us on Fantasy Sports Review on our shows on Thursday nights at 11:30, Saturdays at 1:30, and I think Saturdays at 3:30 in the morning or something like that. But we're always on here on Channel 10. We'll see you guys next time. Enjoy the games this weekend. We'll see you next time on Fantasy Sports Review. Goodbye, everybody.